them in a modern context that was easily digestible for the modern German and Austrian.
Okay, so you mentioned one thing I want to talk about, which is the Thule Society. What was that, and what was its influence on the Nazi Party?
Right. So what I try to do in the book is trace the genealogy of the Thule Society. So in the historiography, this is a perfect example of what we talked about earlier. Through the 60s or 70s, the Thule Society often came up as this shadowy organization that in some ways helped create the Nazi Party. And then in the 80s and 90s, people say, well, yeah, some Nazis were in the Thule Society or went to their meetings but weren't officially members. But Hitler himself didn't like it and was never a member and made fun of them. And Goebbels was never a member. And they pretty quickly dismissed anyone who was in the Thule Society. So it's really not terribly useful to link those two things, right? And so that was my question, is what role does the Thule Society, which was an explicitly occult society, play? First of all, where did it come from? And then what role did it play going forward? Is there really a story there? First of all, it comes from a long tradition going back to the late 19th century of kind of folkish, esoteric groups. So if you take, for example, independently, let's say you're a German or Austrian historian who has no interest in the occult, and someone says, name the most famous anti-Semites and proto-Nazis, kind of racist anti-Semitic leaders of the late 19th century. You name people like Theodor Fritsch, who was this guy from Saxony who wrote the anti-Semitic catechism already in the 1880s. He was like the most famous anti-Semite in Germany. You talk about someone like Karl Lueger or Georg von Schonerer, the leader of the Pan-Germans in Austria, who Hitler openly talked about as models for his own views on politics. And what's interesting about the people I just mentioned is they were almost all in, at some point, one of these occult societies. Whether it was the Templars, Guido von List Ariosophic societies. Theodor Fritsch was an Ariosoph, the guy I just mentioned, the anti-Semite. So much so that he founded his own folkish esoteric group before World War I called the German Order, which is kind of a knightly Masonic order, super racist. You had to prove you were an Aryan going back 300 years. They had weird occult rituals. They used the swastika, this Indo-Aryan symbol of racial, spiritual purity and the sun, right?
So the swastika was in use even before Nazi Party officially comes on the scene.
All over the place, because in the 19th century, people interested in Indo-Aryan religion and occultism recognized the swastika was a central kind of symbol there and appropriated it. So the Nazis, again, swastika was on everything. All these right-wing and anti-Semitic groups, almost all of them used the swastika. My point being that before World War I, there was already thousands of these people running around. Some of them are famous to historians as anti-Semite. And what I point out in the book is many of them were also members of occult societies or esoteric, folkish Templar orders. Whether they believed in astrology or not, they're hanging out in these groups, reading these journals. And one of them, this guy Theodor Fritsch I mentioned, the most famous anti-Semite in Germany, arguably, founds his own order, the German Order, in 1912, the goal of which is to transcend all this kind of splintering he's seen in the right-wing anti-Semitic movement, which, like the Nazis 10 years later, wasn't getting a lot of votes. Everyone knows who they are. They're very loud. They're very shrill. Some Jewish intellectuals are afraid of them, but most parties dismiss them, as the socialist leader does, as a socialism of fools. Rather than looking at what capitalism actually does, they blame everything on Jews. And one of these guys, Theodor Fritsch, founds this order. At the same time, he founds a political association, almost like a party, called the Hammer Association, because he wants to transcend this culture of just getting together, bourgeois society, and complaining about everything. He wants to somehow get workers and peasants and intellectuals and army leaders to all join his party so they can get rid of Jews and communists and liberals and create a great German empire that's racially pure. So the occult group that he founds is linked to a political party. And during the war, this party doesn't really do very well. There's a war going on. People don't want to pay dues. It's still very bourgeois. They still have weird debates over racial theory and astrology and stuff. But during the war, one of the chapters of the German Order, the one in Munich, a guy named Hermann Pohl is kind of charged with resuscitating it. And he meets a guy named Rudolf von Sabbatendorf, this head of the astrological journal I mentioned. And they together try to resuscitate the German Order in Munich in 1917, near the end of the war. And it's not doing very well. And they have their kind of own independent traditions going on there. They're not getting a lot of supporters. But so Sabbatendorf, while he's working to create his own chapter of the German Order, he meets a guy named Nauhaus, this is all in the book, who has his own working group called the Thule Society, named after the ancient Atlantean civilization that the occultists all talk about. But in Germanic tradition, it's called Thule or Thule, from, I think, ancient Greek or Roman maps. This kind of where Iceland might be, that's what they called the ancient Atlantean civilization that they thought had declined because the Aryans started mating with non-Aryans, or there was a flood. So he's got this Thule Society, which is a kind of occult discussion group. And Sabbatendorf is like, maybe we can call our group the Thule Society, because then it doesn't sound like a political party. It sounds like some kind of debating group, cult matters. And in 1918, in the last few months of the war, they create the Thule Society out of what was the German Order. And what does the Thule Society then do in 1918, 1919? It tries to do what Theodor Fritsch was trying to do already in 1912, 1913, 1914, create a political basis for this movement. And many later Nazis turn out to have been attending their meetings. Hans Frank, the kind of head of the general government in Poland later on, Central and the Holocaust, was a member or at least an associate of the party. Dietrich Eckart went to their meetings. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. So we have evidence that these future Nazi leaders are going to Thule Society meetings. In this early milieu, these first few months, you have Nazis and people who would end up not being Nazis, all associated with the Thule Society. At some point, Harrer, who's a leader of the Thule Society and who helps edit the paper, and this guy named Anton Drexler, who's a former railroad worker, I think, both start to say, you know what, we're still not getting workers. We're still not getting a lot of normal people. We're still meeting in the Four Seasons Hotel because, that's where bourgeois people met.
This is a society for elites still.
It's still pretty elite, right? We're not reaching out. So they say, why don't we start a workers' circle to get more workers involved? And within about 8 or 10 weeks of that idea, they actually create a party called the German Workers' Party, which was loosely associated at the time with the Thule Society through Harrer, because Harrer was a member, but wasn't explicitly part of the Thule Society. It was the beginning of a break from the Thule Society, saying, you know what, this is still elite, it's still kind of pre-war and it's elitism. Maybe it's still a little too interested in the occult per se, but the point is, members of the Thule and Nazis who were associated with the Thule were now working within this new Workers' Party in early 1919. And Hitler came to one of their meetings in September, was impressed by the ideas they were talking about, not necessarily how they articulated the ideas, was invited to join and became a leader of that party. So what I try to show in the book is that you don't have to have Hitler saying, yes, the Thule Society is the basis of the Nazi party. He can even make fun of some occultists if he wants. It's clear that the party and a lot of its leaders came out of that same milieu. That's what I try to show.
Now, what about Hitler himself? He's coming of age